Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. Professor Sir Dieter Helm is known as one of the architects of the economics of natural capital, but his interest in agricultural land use runs deeper, and last month he produced a new essay called The Future of British Farming. For Helm, British farming stands on the brink of its most profound transformation since the coming of tractors and fertilisers. But the vision he sets out is somewhat disturbing. The paper describes the technical and financial forces shaping modern agriculture while treating regenerative farming with a sceptic's eye. Helm calls for pollution pricing to drive sustainable change. For example, he says that farmers should pay for nutrient leaching, not be paid to prevent it. But what would that mean for the emerging natural capital markets that he once championed? And in moving to a purely public payments for public goods system of farm support, as Helm advocates, would the state not be abrogating its duty to repair the very nature that its policies and subsidies over decades did so much to deplete? Professor Sir Dieter Helm is with me now to discuss his paper, and we're also joined by regenerative and organic farmer Patrick Holden, the chief executive of the Sustainable Food Trust. Hello both. Dieter, I read your essay as a rather dystopian view of the future of British agriculture. Was that your intention when you wrote it?
Certainly not. And if you read that into the essay, I clearly didn't write it as I intended. What I was trying to do is something quite different, which is to set out what the big changes in the fundamentals of agriculture currently underway are, how big they are, and then to draw out some of the consequences. Now, it's a bit like, if you ask me to write a paper about what causes climate change, I wouldn't start by saying, I'd like it to be like this. I would say, these are the fundamentals. This is what's going on. Things like AI, data centers, quantum computing, etc. The need for a 24/7 firm power, etc. I set that out, right? And that's what I'm doing in agriculture. I'm simply saying, if you really don't think digitalization is taking place, well, good luck to you. If you really don't think that genetic science has been utterly transformed, good luck to you. Okay. And if you think that we can carry on with a world in which farming essentially is a huge financial asset attached to the day-to-day business of finance, of doing the actual farming, and that this is a credible long-term way of running farming, well, I disagree. But, then you have to think through these big changes are taking place. What are the consequences? What's our farming world going to look like mid-century? And I speculate about that.
And I guess it's about different sort of senses of different futures, and I guess part of it is about the degree to which we see the future as inevitable, and which elements of the future we see as being most inevitable. Whether ecological breakdown, for example, might be more inevitable than the increase in the amount of technology that's being used. So, Patrick, at the top of Dieter's essay, he says that missing from both the government and industry lobbying sides is any serious long-term plan for agriculture and agricultural policy. Now, I think it would be pretty hard to disagree with that generally, but you have one. You have a vision of the future. What is it?
Well, before I try to answer that question, let me first say I do agree with Dieter. And actually, I agree with quite a lot more that he brings up in his essay, which I just recently read last night, actually. So I think we're not going to, I'm sure there's going to be some sort of areas where we have different perspectives, but a lot of what you say, Dieter, I think is fascinating. And I do agree with you that the forces that you've described, which act on all farmers, including myself, I think are absolutely there and they're not going to go away. I guess I'm a bit of an idealist, although I am a practitioner as well. And I'm stupid, perhaps, enough to think that the farming system that we're running here could go to scale. What will be the key features of that system? Trying to minimize the use of non-renewable, polluting, damaging inputs, and at the same time producing as much food as we can from the natural capital, and I'd argue the social and human capital that occupies this hill, and to try to navigate in an economic environment where the polluter doesn't pay, and we are not currently being rewarded for all the public goods that we are delivering. and operating in a state of perhaps naive hope that those deficiencies will be corrected in time. So I think we set out our vision in a way, in our Feeding Britain from the Ground Up report, which I'm not sure if you've seen, Dieter, but basically it models taking regenerative agriculture to scale across the UK, and it looks at the impacts on outcomes and diets. We could go into that, but I think what you might say to criticise that report is that the economic and policy conditions for achieving that do not yet exist. And the question is, could they?
Dieter, any thoughts?
Yes. I mean, as you recognise, Patrick, regenerative agriculture is a very broad church, and there are lots of different bits in it. But for example, the idea that we should use fewer inputs to produce, well, same output or maybe less output, whatever, okay, is very, very supported by the digitalization and the AI, etc., that's coming forward. Indeed, you know, in a AI-enabled digital world, the drill bit can tell you an incredible amount about what's happening in each particular point. Now, you may not want to use pesticides at all. I'm very sympathetic with that idea. But if you are doing so, as we have done, one of the reasons why the use of pesticides has been declining is precisely the kind of precision agriculture, which is only possible if you have these digital technologies. You know, in the good old days, and I think back to my grandfather's farm, he had a feel for what was going on in each bit of the field. He could tell you which bit was damper. He could tell you where particular kinds of weeds were likely to be more prevalent. He could tell you where germination would be good or bad, because he'd got a lifetime of experience of doing that. Now, nearly all of that is now data, right? And that's a fantastic change. It's like the bank manager used to know all his customers or her customers, and now data tells you a vast amount more in any banking transaction. So yeah, to argue that these changes aren't necessarily against the grain of what you want to do, I don't necessarily subscribe to what you want to do, is to miss the point.
I wasn't arguing that. I'm agreeing with you.
These technologies are available.
I totally agree with you. I think we're entering a data age, and we, meaning the Sustainable Food Trust, have become very involved with this, because what we are trying to do is to develop a common framework for measuring the impact of farming systems on climate, nature, and people. And to achieve that, you need data. So we're thick into the weeds of data. And talking of weeds and individual field conditions, I do not think that the data collection exercise with which we are involved, particularly my wife, if I'm honest, is inconsistent or incompatible with having knowledge of an individual field. So, for instance, we're growing carrots this year on 2 acres. And as you can imagine, the top of the field, because we're a bit slopey, differs substantially from the bottom of the field. And yes, the soil mapping that we're part of will gather that data. And indeed, next year, I might, even if I'm lucky, have a machine which will have cameras on it to identify the weeds and zap them and leave the carrots growing. So, you know, we're involved in all that sort of stuff as well. But I think you're wrong if you think that the arrival of the data era is going to render the knowledge that every farmer has, more or less, of the individual unique circumstances of the sort of microbiome or ecosystem which they're managing will become redundant. I think that's wrong.
Yeah, I didn't say that. Just to be clear, I just said that it augments that very substantially. And the balance of a world in which you really did need that hands-on knowledge, specific knowledge and years of experience, to the world we're now in for much agricultural production, that balance has shifted.
Yes.
And what comes out at the end of the drill bit that goes to, I don't know, John Deere or whoever the equipment lease supplier is fantastically different from what went before. And it's true across a whole series of technologies. For example, you know, if you're horizontally drilling for, let's say, shale gas or whatever, you don't have to have the expertise that a wildcatter used to have you've got at the end of the drill bit a fabulous piece of technology which tells you absolutely almost anything you need to know about that frame. Now that's the direction of change, and the two changes together, that and the AI and the massive data sets that are constructible around that, and those tools in the hands of farmers, together with what synthetic biology and modern genetics are doing, is to me bigger than the shift from horses to tractors. And we might want to disinvest tractors, disinvent tractors, like we might want to disinvest the Haber-Bosch process. But the reality is they were utterly transformational. And that's all I'm saying in my paper. I'm not making a judgment whether it's good or bad. I'm simply saying that's what's happening.
I guess the question partly, Patrick, just
sorry.
to sort of come back in on that, and maybe you can comment on this, is the question of how transformational it might be. Because, of course, tractors coming in and fertilizer, we saw an incredible boom in the amount of food that was being produced from parcels of land. Whereas my understanding is that much as AI and technology and data collection are fundamentally important, and yes, I mean, agree with both of you that they are delivering change, and many conversations I have with regenerative farmers, not just here but elsewhere in the world, is about the way that they can tweak the level of inputs, they can help to boost production. But that level of boosting of production is likely to be relatively small in comparison with transformations we've seen in the past.
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry, is that for me or Dieter?
That was for Patrick.
Okay, well, I violently agree with Dieter about the sort of epoch level change that these new factors are bringing into our farming. But I think, I'm not doing this just to disagree with you, Dieter, but I think that what you're describing can be harnessed to beneficial effect without negating the deep knowledge of stewardship that I have, and love indeed that I have for my landscape. And so I think the two are not mutually incompatible, is my point. And I think that's a really important point to raise, because some of the technology which is coming on, like all the sort of knowledge of the genome and everything else, I think we need to put all these technologies through a very careful, rigorous screen and reject the ones that are incompatible with proper regenerative farming. And I also agree with your point that there's a sloppy inadequate definition of what regenerative means. Not that I think we should have a totally legal definition of it, but there is an issue there which we could also discuss. But certainly on my farm, I'm not against all these new technologies. I agree with you that economic framework is changing, but I want to apply that through the lens of a human being and a family managing an ecosystem. And I want family farming of that kind to survive the heralding of these new and background conditions.
Well, I'm sure you do. And I'm sure there's an argument to be made for conventional, traditional family farming. But we do need a little bit of perspective here. So we got from 2 billion people to 8 billion people in the 20th century, and broke out of, well, it started in the 19th century, but broke out of the constraints, essentially, that someone like Malthus would have understood. That there was a very big constraint on the amount of food that could be produced, and the population of the world was limited by that. In the 20th century, whether we'd like it or not, whether it's good or bad, it was the utter transformation, dare I say, through fossil fuels, of agriculture, which meant that 8 billion people are mostly pretty well fed today. Right? It is extraordinary. And that is artificial fertilizers at scale, tractor power, and the internal combustion engine, etc., etc. And if we look forward into the future and ask ourselves, so where is all this food going to be produced? Because if people are going to get richer and developing countries want to move up the food hierarchy, look at what's happening in China in terms of pork and chicken and so on. If they do, it may not be a good thing, but if they do, where is food at scale going to be produced, and how is it going to be produced? And if I ask myself, is it going to be the conventional family farm, as in the UK model that's developed? My answer is a bit. But if you look at the frontier of all this stuff, and you look at what indoor farming is doing, you look what intensive farming is doing in the east of England. It may be environmentally awful, and there may be serious environmental costs, but the capacity to marry together the genetics and the synthetic biology with the informational technologies we have today is likely, in my view, to induce a food production world which you won't like, I probably won't like, but one which is very, very different from the model of your farm. And I would say one thing further, which is the split between organic and regenerative. I mean, a lot of regenerative farming is basically glyphosate farming, right? Whereas organic is very different. And as a consequence, perfectly understandably, organic farming tends to be higher cost and tends to have somewhat lower outputs, at least when we think about it at scale. Regenerative farming is basically a step towards using glyphosate. And I mean, you know, conventional farmers use this stuff all the time, including to dry a crop just before they harvest it to go into the food chain. And this is a world of difference between what's really going on in a lot of regenerative farming and what you do in your regenerative but organic farming practices too. And they are not in the same planet. Much regenerative farming doesn't look a lot different from the farmer as fields I can see out my window here, who basically uses glyphosate and doesn't plow and doesn't drill, but is about the most intense farming practice I know for miles around.
Patrick, could you come back and comment on the regenerative element of that? Because, you know, what Dieter's describing there is not my understanding of regenerative farming at all. Although a little bit of glyphosate is used in some sort of forms of regenerative agriculture. Certainly, if we're talking about livestock, then there's, you know, none of that at all. And what you're getting instead is a really vastly different level, a very high level of ecological output as well. And so let's just start with that sort of idea that all that regenerative farming is just you know, glyphosate farming. And also, just before I sort of go on to that, I want to sort of mention the way in which for regenerative farming to be successful, it obviously needs to produce a lot of food. And so from a kind of punter perspective, fields might look quite similar in terms of what's coming out of it. I'm reminded of Leontino Balbo Jr., who produces so much of the world's organic sugar. You look at his fields from above and it's just a monoculture of sugarcane, but at the same time what's happening on the ground, the amount of biodiversity that's there, the hundreds of arthropods that he's getting, many more than any nature reserves sort of in the similar area, you know, are phenomenal because he's changed the way that he's farming, but is getting a much more resilient crop as a result.
Well, I mean, just before I try to address some of the points you ask about regenerative and organic farming, just to say, again, Dieter, I love the sharpness of your intellect. I think you're raising uncomfortable issues, and I welcome that, and thank you for doing so. To your last contribution, the only thing I disagree with about what you said is you said, well, we're pretty well fed nowadays because of the Haber-Bosch process and all that went with the chemistry which followed it, and the intensification of agriculture, which defied Malthus, if you like. The only thing I'd challenge is that we're pretty well fed. I think if you've read or know about Chris Van Tulleken's work on ultra-processed food, and you go back before the farm gate, I would say that the commodity crops, which are more or less responsible for probably, God knows, probably 80% of all the food that we eat today, maybe even more than that, are nutrient deficient, contaminated with chemical residues, and poor for our microbiome. And I think that there is a growing awareness, particularly amongst young people, which is very interesting, that the link between farming practice, food quality, nutrient density, food safety, and health is going to be a big emergent driver for change. So I'd just like to sort of bookmark that. But to come on to your points about the difference between regenerative and organic farming, I think you probably pigeonholed me as a sort of ideologically committed organic person. But in fact, I'm quite keen on the whole idea of regenerative farming being a step towards farming more in harmony with nature. But I completely agree with your analysis, if this is what it is, that was what it was, that a lot of regenerative farming is extremely dependent on Roundup glyphosate. And in my opinion, that farming with that degree of dependency is actually not very regenerative. And I think when we start properly measuring the impact on biodiversity and soil carbon of those regenerative farmers who are scapegoating the plough to hide, in my view, their dependence, their umbilical dependence on Roundup, I think we'll find that many of those farming systems actually are not very good for biodiversity or soil carbon, but we need to collect the data to find out. So I think it's really important that we look at whether those farming systems are truly regenerative. And certainly if you're looking out of your window and seeing an orange field, which I suspect is what it looks like at this time of year, there is no biodiversity in it because it's all been sprayed off. So I think, there's a lot to talk about there. The question is whether seriously regenerative farming can go to scale, meaning farming that is regenerative both of nature and addresses climate and produces really good food. And I think there are opportunities for that which won't necessarily be organic.
Okay, just a couple of quick points, because we agree on most things here, as we often do. So I agree with you entirely that we have replaced in developed countries, and indeed increasingly in developing countries, a world in which quite a lot of people were short of food, full stop. And we had a lot of people globally, including actually in China, who were not starving, but, in a pretty bad way because they didn't have enough food. We've replaced that with a world in which we've got too much of the wrong sort of food. We've got obesity, we've got all sorts of diseases and problems. And frighteningly, especially amongst the young, there might be enlightened young people who see the light, etc. But that's the people who write in the newspapers and appear on the television, etc., and go on social media. For the vast bulk of people, this isn't their world. Okay, so what's the answer to that? Well, someone like me would say, the externalities involved in this are not being paid for properly. Okay?
Correct.
So it's not, etc., etc. So remember, in my world, it's a world in which these technologies just happen. Right? They are happening. It's not even the future, it's now. Okay. But they're not necessarily good in their outcomes. So for me, polluters should pay. Public goods should be provided. Now, if we applied the polluter pays principle to the damage that quite a lot of this high processed and other food does, to the extent it does, we had proper sugar taxes and all those kinds of things, then the outcomes would be very different. But what they wouldn't make go away is the fact that this is in a context in which our knowledge of genetics, genomes, and synthetic biology is just phenomenally different from 5 years ago, let alone 10. And our information technologies are exploding all around us. And I think you need to put those things together to get a picture going forward. On the glyphosate, yeah, I mean, I'm amazed. I did a presentation at Farm Ed down the road from me on this paper last week, and I mentioned some things about glyphosate. The pushback's enormous. But I remember when after a crop of wheat or barley or whatever, there was a lot of undergrowth. The sheep were put on it, and then it was ploughed in because the organic material went into the soil. Now we're told that that's much worse than just killing everything on the surface. But
which is nonsense, by the way.
Yeah, my picture of a glyphosate field is he's dead.
It's utterly dead.
Stuff in the soil that's better than it might otherwise have been if you'd been badly ploughed with heavy tractors, etc.
Correct.
Right? But this cannot be, environmentally a great idea to douse.
It's a terrible idea
with glyphosate.
It's a terrible idea, and the sooner it's banned, the better. You can't blame farmers for using it while they can make more money if they grow crops every year, put a catch crop, a cover crop in, and then spray it off. But in terms of what it's doing to nature and probably to the human microbiome, I think it's really bad news. And so I think we're completely aligned on that. But I just raised one other issue about the gene editing and all that goes with that, the knowledge of the genome. It's interesting. We we used to grow oats here that were the best varieties of the time, you know, because they keep evolving, the varieties keep changing. 4 years ago, I got a couple of sweet jars of heritage black oats, which used to be grown in Wales on these poorer, more, you know, challenging microclimates and soil conditions until about the 60s. And then the Welsh plant breeding station came along. We had lots of new varieties of oats, and now the generation of new varieties is increasing faster, as you say. But anyway, 4 years after we got these two sweet jars of black oats, which are the traditional oats, we had enough this year to drill our entire 30-acre block of oats, which we feed to the cows, with these black oats. And what was really interesting was that the combine driver, who happens to be, because there are not that many cereals grown in West Wales nowadays, he happens to have those sort of not a monopoly, but he's combining the majority of the grains grown in West Wales, including the Aberystwyth plant breeding station, where they are responsible for the emergence of new varieties of oats. His comment was that he didn't see anything he was combining in Aberystwyth which is any better than these black oats that are very long strawed, that smother out the weeds, and yet they, as you said, the aftermath is full of unsown plants and is really good grazing. We won't plough it until the spring for a next crop anyway. And the nutrient density of these oats appears to be different because the cows really milk well on them. So I'm just thinking that in a world where we're thinking that we can improve on nature, sometimes epigenetic adaptation, both of animals and plants, I think can actually rival this incredible new knowledge we have. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it or pay attention to it, but certainly if the combine driver's analysis is right, we shouldn't turn our back on some of these traditional varieties.
Well, who would want to? It's not an or, it's an and. What we now can do is tell you a huge amount about what that traditional black oats, I'm not familiar with the territory, as you'll obviously be aware, but can tell you vastly more about it than we knew before. And what's more, the data from what's going on in the field, right down to the, you know, really quite very close density, can be fed together. And so we can feed the two together. So I don't see any contradiction at all in that. And what's more, I think it's incredibly important that we use the technologies to record all the varieties we have before we lose them. Because one of the problems about modern agriculture, again, you're much more familiar with this stuff than me, but is that how very, very small number of varieties we use.
Exactly.
We've seen that in dairy cattle, we've seen it in beef, we see it in wheat, we see it barley, we see rapeseed oil, and we lose a lot of that. Fortunately, people are building seed banks and taking this stuff seriously, but it's not an or, it's an and the new technologies help with that process, not hinder it. What hinders it is where large oligopolies in the industrial side of equipment, plant breeding, etc., control those outcomes. And I don't think it would be the case, back to our earlier bit of conversation, that we'd be using glyphosate in quite the scale we did if it hadn't been for Monsanto and now its successor promoting it so hard. And that's what we have to be careful about letting particular interests narrow the opportunities that are available. Technologies are neutral to that.
And of course,
ffinlo, we're in danger of agreeing with each other too much.
No, it's absolutely fine. You know, what I'm interested in is having, you know, is the two of you having a conversation and finding where those points of agreement are. And if they're broad, that's great. But then finding where those points of disagreement and challenge are as well. And one of the things I'm sort of struck by, Dieter, is that you have, you know, very beautifully described, and I think this is sort of part of the challenge on social media, the way that some farmers have read your essay, is that it's quite a description of what many people would see as being quite a dystopia around the technologies and so on. But then beyond that description of the world as it is, I'm interested in the world that you would like to see, because of course, in terms of natural capital, you were very, you know, sort of instrumental in driving policy changes. I don't think there's any disagreement between the three of us that data is fundamental.
Can I jump in there and say, Schumacher, did you read Small is Beautiful, Dieter?
Many, many times.
Okay, because I mean, he was an economist, And the subtitle of his book, The Study of Economics as If People Mattered. And I guess that's where I think we might be able to tease out some points of difference, because you're describing what I think is a very bleak outcome to these new forces coming into the equation. And I'm thinking, no, there are counter forces which may stop that bleak outcome. And I guess I'd love to explore that more with you.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you could sort of set out some of that to start with, Patrick, because I think there are two visions of agriculture. One is the one that has been described very clearly in Dieter's essay. The other is a world which is much more regenerative organic, where there is much greater diversity, where the supply chain has been interrupted for whatever reason, and we have shorter supply chains as a result of that, and there is a change. And of course, as part of this, we need this massive transformation in the way land is used away from fossil fuels that would be fueling the sort of vertical farms that Dieter's talking about, a lot of the the more industrial processes, and therefore in the future, if we're talking about food security at a global level, we may not be able to get our hands on those things anyway. So it's sort of trying to sort of identify what the world might look like in 20 years' time with geopolitical instability, ecological breakdown, and therefore say, well, okay, we know what the world is now in terms of the way that farming works and the financialization of farming. What should it be? And of course, how do we get there?
Okay,
so that's a question to you, Dieter, is it? I think. Yeah.
I think it might be. Okay. So first of all, you mustn't assume that, I mean, I'm not in favour or against, but I observe how much more production takes place indoors rather than outdoors, whether it be mass production of tomatoes or mushrooms, as my family used to do, or et cetera, okay? But you mustn't confuse vertical farming with fossil fuel farming, right? Go and have a look in that Hutton Institute I did years ago at the vertical farm. It's run on renewable energy. You don't have to have...
But it's 30 times the amount of energy that non-vertical systems are using. And also, they're economically, they're falling apart.
If it's renewable, the sun comes up every day, right? We're not short of energy. We're short of... And just remember, by the way, in your transition from fossil fuels in this world, remember that 84% of the world's energy is fossil fuels. It's over 70-something% in this country. And actually, globally, the demand for all of these things continues to go up. And just because you think you might not use fossil fuels, almost everything you use and buy into your farm has had fossil fuels behind it. Your tractor is an amazing piece of fossil fuel production, from the steel, the mining, the iron ore, etc. And if you stick a battery in it, just think about the fossil fuels involved in the lithium, the copper, the cobalt, and the nickel, etc. But that's an aside. Okay, so what should farming look like? So in the paper, I don't say what it should look like. I say the fundamental changes that are taking place in the background. Right? So in a farming policy, which is where government intervenes because the outcomes of a market process are not socially, economically optimal, etc., you have to ask, well, what are the failures here? So the first one is we don't pay for the pollution we cause. We're living environmentally beyond our means. So any rational economist would say you should pay for the carbon that you're emitting. You should pay for the damage to the water systems of all the stuff leaching off your land, etc., etc. So should everyone else. So polluter pays principle is you're never going to have a sustainable agriculture or a sustainable economy if pollution is not properly paid for.
Can I intervene and say I completely agree, but I think we also agree that in the near future, the government are unlikely to introduce the polluter pays principle to agriculture, because it's going to have the effect of putting the price of food up, and that's politically unattractive.
Look, let's be clear, right? I'm not suggesting we're going to have a sustainable economy. I'm not suggesting that agriculture is about to become environmentally benign, right? I don't think it is.
It should be.
I agree with you, because I would like to live in a sustainable economy. But the electorate aren't voting to pay more for their food.
Correct.
Right? Okay?
Correct.
And they're not paying and not voting to do anything that seriously addresses carbon emissions either.
Not yet.
Contrary. No, the net zero consensus has completely broken down. right?
Well,
Right.
no, it's not. It hasn't completely broken down.
Well,
I know because I'm talking to a lot of companies because I joined
no,
this thing.
no, I said consensus. I didn't
Yes.
say everybody's given up on net zero. I said that we had a consensus when it wasn't costing us anything. Now we have the most expensive electricity in the industrial world, right? And the voters are going in a direction which is not helpful for climate change.
But you'll know that one of the reasons why the electricity is so expensive is because our vulnerability to imported fossil fuel energy has increased.
Absolute rubbish, Patrick. Okay, the price of gas in real terms is now below the 5 and 10-year average. What we're doing is making sure, and for climate change reasons, perfectly understandably, that we're not going to benefit from lower gas prices in the future. We assume we're going to run out with the stuff and it's going to be high and volatile. If only we've got enough fossil fuels to fry the planet several times over. And unfortunately, these things are fantastically cheap for what they deliver. Okay.
Yes,
so I think
but as you also know, so is renewable energy.
The reason why electricity prices are high in the UK is because of the government-driven policy decisions, so that even the wholesale price is only 30% of the total cost now. We have the most expensive nuclear power stations in the world to build. We have really expensive solar and wind once you take into account the system costs. Do you know in this country, we now need 120 gigawatts of capacity to meet what 60 gigawatts used to do. We need twice the size of the grid, and we need all the storage and batteries and everything else. And then people tell you that renewables are 9 times cheaper. If only that was true. It is not true. And it's very, very important to get this energy question right, because a lot of agriculture, like everything else in our world, is energy. Marx should have talked about the energy theory of value, not the labour theory of value.
It is also true, isn't it, that the market has had to bear the cost of developing renewable energy in a way that it never had to do with fossil fuels or nuclear.
Come on. If it's 9 times cheaper, right, the market had to bear the development costs of the iPhone and the original computer. There are a huge number of things the market develops because there's a profitable market at the end. We pay very large subsidies, right? And I'm not against the subsidies either. I'm simply saying that we've now got to a point where we're told it's 9 times cheaper by the Secretary of State. It isn't. The system costs are very considerably higher. And what we need is twice the energy system and all the pylons and all the batteries and everything else to produce the same output. It's called the broken windows fallacy.
But
break windows, let's say new windows in place and you think you're better off at the result. You're not.
Let's say you're right on the huge cost of getting the infrastructure in. But what does definitely happen once you've got that in is that the price per unit, say using PV, the price for PV units has dropped dramatically in the last few years.
That's not true. It's true of the marginal cost that's come down dramatically, very dramatically. But the system costs of all the backup and support that's required. Let me give you an example.
Well, okay? I can give you an example on my own farm if you want me to.
No, I've got my own solar panels at home. It's great, right? But the system is quite different. So if you take where we put a lot of, let's say, offshore wind off the coast of Scotland, right? It's a long way from the market. Scotland has excess energy, right? It costs at least £113 a megawatt hour in subsidy, right? It has to have all the transmission lines, the pylons, everything else created to take it down to the south of England. And then, let's just be clear, it only works about 40 or 50% of the time. And when even in that time, actually in Scotland, for 40% of the time it actually works, we pay it to produce electricity which we do not use. These costs do not go away because the marginal cost of a wind turbine, which is actually going up, not down anymore, or the very low cost of the marginal cost of solar panel goes south. You're not paying the true costs of the system of your
I couldn't possibly couldn't deny that the system costs associated with creating the infrastructure to be able to use the renewables, they are there and they are very significant. Getting the grid sort of updated is going to be several decades long project. It's really important. But of course, that all had to be done in the first place for fossil fuels. And so the trouble is that we're looking at the cost of renewables now with those system costs built in, and we're trying to compare them with something where the system already exists, which makes it difficult.
The point is we need double the system to produce the same output. In fact, demand
but that doesn't matter, does it, Dieter? It doesn't matter.
And the second thing that's true is the outcome of this, which no doubt our Prime Minister and our Secretary of State will be explaining in Brazil, in claiming world leadership, is we have the most expensive electricity, industrial electricity in the world. As a result, grain smelts going, the steel industry going, the fertilizer industry is closed down, the car industry outputs are momentarily back to the 1948 level and then back in the 1950s. We've closed most of British industry as a result of this. Now, no, it's absolutely obvious. Of course, emissions fall as a result of that. We can import the stuff like we import the beef from Brazil. We can import the steel from China. We aren't improving on climate change as a result. You have to be
wait a minute.
realistic about this.
Let me just ask you what I don't know what you're for anymore, because you say you are in favour of renewable energy and you've got PV cells. I haven't got enough, and I'm massively dependent on fossil fuel energy on this farm, diesel and everything else that you've mentioned. But what do you want to happen? You're not being clear about that.
I am. And I haven't written in this paper on farming, but I have more generally. So indeed, I have another recent paper out on the subject. So if we want to address climate change, and I really do, we should address climate change. We shouldn't kid ourselves with domestic net zero carbon territorial production targets. We should mark our carbon consumption. We should take into account the imports. We shouldn't claim that Drax isn't producing carbon emissions in the UK because of UN accounting figures. We should look at the imports, and this is very important for agriculture as well as for industry more generally. And we should spend our money in a way which has the maximal impact on reducing global emissions and increasing global sequestration.
Can I intervene and say, let's supposing you're right on that. I'm a farmer farming 300 acres, which is like a cell of the energy system or the food system, depending on it's both really. At a cellular level, what should I do? Well, I'll tell you what I've done so far. I haven't used any chemical fertilizers or pesticides for 52 years. So I'm trying to farm with, as I said at the beginning, with an ecosystem which is producing a genuine surplus of food without depleting our natural capital. But I'm also trying to wean myself off fossil fuel energy because that's my biggest dependency. And what I'm planning to do is a combination of solar PV and wind. And yes, possibly some batteries, because I take your point that it's, you need to produce more in order to wean yourself off it. Do you think that's a bad plan?
For you, I'm sure it's great. Do I think that British agriculture is in a position to do that? No.
Why not? Right? Why not?
Well, but why? Because, the incentive structure around much of British agriculture, in fact, all of it, points in the opposite direction.
Well, yeah, that may be true, but I've done it.
Gentlemen, you've done it. The farmer outside my door is extremely profitable.
I want to move on.
If I told him he was going to do what you suggest you do, he would just laugh.
I want to move on from the energy conversation because we've only got 10 minutes left, and there are three areas that I would like to cover. The first is to sort of go back on the polluter pays element, because I think, again, there would be broad agreement that the principle of the polluter pays is a good one. The question is who pays? And when it comes to food production, who is it that has driven the problem in the first place? Who has benefited from the markets that have been created and the food that's been created? And therefore, who needs to be be paying for that pollution during that period of transition, because the transition from one type of farming to another, from an intensive industrialized model to a regenerative and organic model, is enormous. And at the moment, all of the risk seems to be on the farmer. Very little seems to be on either the customer or on often the processing giants, or on the government itself. And what concerns me about your position on the polluter pays idea, on the idea that farmers shouldn't be paid not to leach their nutrients, as is happening currently with water companies, but instead to be charged for leaching those nutrients in the first place, sort of avoids the uncomfortable history that for decades government has been telling farmers to maximize and prioritize food abundance, and have just completely been okay with the externalization of these ecological and social costs. So who should be paying?
It's been worse than that. Think about red diesel. We actually relatively subsidize pollution in farming, right?
Yeah.
So
why does all that responsibility land on the farmer?
Just come back, okay? So the reason you want to make polluters pay is you want to change the incentives they confront. Now, there are people out there who are, benign, good farming citizens caring about the future, like Patrick, okay? You shouldn't design policy for altruists. You should just assume people are going to behave in ways that maximize their profits. And then you should address the incentives to do that. And if they go as far as Patrick does, brilliant. And if it turns out to be more profitable, even better. But we don't go around.
Dieter, we're agreeing. I mean, we are actually agreeing, because I agree with you that the application of the polluter pays principle is logical. We probably also agree it's not going to happen tomorrow for the reasons we just discussed, because it's politically unattractive. I think where there may be a difference between us is whether it's carrots and sticks, isn't it? The stick is polluter pays principle applied, not being applied, which is annoying, and that's why extractive farming pays better than proper regenerative farming. The carrot would be to, first of all, measure the public goods coming out of a farming system, including, I would argue, the human and social public goods, and then to find mechanisms for rewarding the public goods outcomes. I'm not sure if you even disagree with that.
No. Look. There are two principles on the face of the Agricultural Act, which sits alongside the Environment Act and is part and parcel of the framework that came out of the Natural Capital Committee. One is polluter pays, which we're clearly not doing properly.
No.
And the second one is public money for public goods.
Correct.
Now,
so we're agreeing on both.
No, hang on. Let me finish. It was always the intention, and it's been deeply perverted, that the major public goods, being largely in the uplands, but also in some of the lowlands too, in sensitive farming practices, etc., that have lasted.
Soil is on the lowlands.
Yeah, no, okay, no, I agree, okay. But this is where the money would flow. And that's where the public money for the public goods would go, to where the public goods are most likely produced and best produced.
Well, I really disagree with you on that.
That has not happened, right? And what we've had instead, which I think is very sad, is that we've got rid of the payments for producing food. We've got rid of the payments for owning land, what was Cap 1, etc. And we replaced it by the Treasury essentially trying to reduce the overall budget to agriculture to as close to zero as possible, like in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay, and there are arguments the Treasury mount for that approach relative to other bits of the economy, but the reality is that you have absurd positions like the government claiming it's going around the largest subsidy budget for that's ever been for the next 2 years, etc., forgetting there's been 25% inflation. The squeeze is really fast. There isn't the money going into agriculture for the public goods there ought to be.
So are you arguing for more money?
Are heavily squeezed.
Are you arguing for more money, Dieter? Are you arguing for more money, Dieter?
I'm arguing for the appropriate amount of money to address the really important public goods that farming produces. Okay, and what I don't know what the right number is. I'm simply saying, and I say in my paper, that the strategy that we have at the moment is simply to reduce the overall cost to the Treasury of
Well, I
agriculture.
agree with you. I completely
Yeah,
agree
that's
with
what
you.
I'm saying,
Yeah.
right?
Also, the only thing I think you've missed out is you say that food isn't a public good. Well, I'd say just food isn't, but I'd say one of the biggest negative externalities of our current farming system is damage to public health.
Yeah, but we agree about this, Patrick. That's
Yes,
why I
but
want
that
to make
comes through
sure that
food.
those costs are properly reflected in the prices of what is a lot of food that's of very questionable value at all, right? I don't disagree with you at all about that, but I want to address that question head on. Because remember, if you look at agriculture as a whole, the actual farming bit currently is a very small bit of the total value chain of the thing that arrives in Greggs or wherever down the track. You know, that's the massive amount of expenditure in the frame. And that's where the additional costs of what's done to the food, which feeds through into our diet.
No,
So
I think that you might be a
it's
little bit wrong on that.
detrimental. I want to address that question.
I think
Okay?
you're wrong to say it's all after the food leaves the farm gate. I would
No,
say
it's not
that
all after. I didn't say that. I said that the bulk of it is.
I think the
But there's
bulk
a
of it
lot
isn't.
more on the farm itself as well that needs to address. And that's where the polluter pays principle is very important.
I'm saying that I think you might be wrong on that allocation. I would say that ultra processing is adding insult to the very considerable injury that has been done to the commodities which our industrial farms produce. They are nutrient deficient, as I said, and they are probably unsafe because they've got God knows what chemical residues in them. And I would say that if you look at the ratio of the damage done to public health of what happens on the farm or what happens to the commodities after they leave the farm, I'd say it may be a 50-50 split or even in favour of what happens on the farm. So I think...
That's an empirical question. I beg to differ, but it's an empirically resolved.
But it's an important question, isn't it?
It's incredibly important, right?
Yes,
because
we need to measure better.
Policy to deal with the externalities at every stage of this chain, because we do not want to end up in a world where I don't know what percentage of the population is obese, and you know, that's just not here. It's true in developing countries too, and that is not a good outcome. But we may differ about how to go about addressing that.
Possibly not.
We may well agree.
In the few minutes that we have left, I'd just like to move on finally to natural capital markets, because we talked about polluter pays as a principle, you know, a little bit around that. We've talked about the idea of public funds for public goods and the way that, you know, potentially the government ought to be investing much more into that idea of public funds for public goods so that we can help to fuel that transition. Now, natural capital markets are a really important way of farmers earning more money beyond what's coming from government, beyond the cost of or the price of food specifically, in order that they can extend their farm businesses and make sure that they are profitable. What role do you see natural capital playing for farmers these days, Dieter?
Okay, so the key bit here, you say natural capital markets. Okay, so a market is usually the exchange of homogeneous things. Yeah? Oil's a market, right? Most oil's like most oil. Almost all natural capital is not homogeneous, right? It's site specific. Okay. And what's more, natural capital comes in systems, ecosystems, not discrete little projects. Okay. Economist cost benefit analysis is all about discrete projects. Okay. What we want to do environmentally is protect and enhance the ecosystems we have in the soils, the rivers, etc., etc. Okay, so a market, bilateral market, where some developer thinks, oh, look, if I put some houses on this site, hopefully I've glyphosated before I start, so we don't have to worry too much about the loss of biodiversity. But if there is some, I'll pay some person up the road to plant some trees or do something else. Okay, now that seems to me to be a very inefficient way of addressing.
Could not agree more.
Natural capital, right? And I think the system approach is what should be done, and that's what we told DEFRA years ago when this came up under the Natural Capital Committee.
Yeah,
now,
you're right.
The second thing about this, a bit like the landfill levy and my local wildlife trust. However, what this system does is it sucks people in. It's like sucking people in to build solar farms because it's money, right? And people use grass for whatever money's available to do the things that they want to do going forward, or they just grasp for the money for the solar panels and give up the farming altogether. Okay, now that doesn't make it the best way of doing this. And that comes back to, we could design public policy in a much better way to pay farmers to do this environmentally good stuff. And biodiversity is as the prototype public good, so is carbon, etc. Right? And we could do that, or we could just say, let's find a nice little way of letting developers develop more land in greenfield sites, etc., on the green belt, etc., for some ludicrous housing target that's not going to be achieved. That's my problem with it. Okay, now carbon markets are different for emissions, but every carbon sequestration is different too, because the land is different, the soils are different, what the counterfactual is different, what vulnerability to disease, etc. These are all different, and that's where, you know, the nice idea of markets gives, I think, good economics a bad name, and encourages silly ideas about marginal this and marginal that as the way we're going to address these questions. And that's what's gone wrong in this territory, and that's why we're not actually achieving very much. Now,
can I set up?
We've got 30 seconds or so. 30
of
seconds
the
or so
Helm's process, you start to have more system approaches to clusters of farms doing stuff, etc. But this is the exception to what's actually going on. And this government is not environmentally friendly.
Well, if you let me just spill over.
It is, but it is.
You let me spill over the 30 seconds a little bit just to finish ffinlo, because I agree with everything that Dieter has just said. And our proposed antidote to that lamentable situation is to ensure that in future we developed an internationally harmonized framework for measuring the outcomes of farming systems on climate, natural capital and social capital. And we collect data on a farm level, and we then monetize the impact that we measure and develop systems of rewarding positive public goods, because let's assume that the polluter pays principle is already applied. So I agree with Dieter on that one. It isn't, but we'd like it to be. But even if it isn't, if I am paid for my positive climate, nature and people outcomes accurately on a farming system level, rather than this nonsense which biodiversity net gain thing is going on at the moment, I think we could take that to scale. And I'm in conversation with a lot of companies who are trying to do that, and so far it hasn't worked because we haven't got a common measurement framework in place, and we're needing to find the money which will reward the farmers for their positive outcomes. So give you an example, water companies are already paying farmers not to pollute. That is a kind of carrot. And we need to look for where the carrots are in each of the sectors, whether it's soil carbon, which can be in relation to Scope 3 emissions. If we can accurately measure soil carbon gain of a proper biologically based farming system, that can become a revenue stream for a farmer. And I would say there could also be social credits, or whatever you want to call them, for farmers who educate children, who improve the nutrient density of their food, etc. Now, if we could take that to scale, we'd start to move the balance of financial advantage towards the kind of farming system that I'm operating here.
We would. I'm going to have to cut you off, Patrick. I hate to do so, and both of you, thanks so much. It's been fascinating. I've just sat back and listened, and it's been brilliant. So thanks so much for your time. I'd like to thank my guests, Patrick Holden and Professor Sir Dieter Helm. Sadly, we do have a firm cut off, but if you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is the world's highest-ranking food security podcast, and Farmgate leaders, Martin's Farm and Wheat from the Chaff, are available on the Farmgate channel if you just scroll back in your podcast feed, as is our long-running series on natural capital and how that works, called Filling the Funding Gap. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.